I'll get started then. Fantastic. Thanks very much for coming. It is my extreme pleasure to sitting in conversation this evening with Jonathan Kaplan. Jonathan is a man of rare and exceptional and, I dare say, extensive talents. So much so that I've had to write them all down. Jonathan is none other than an author. He's also a photographer, a TV producer, director, cameraman, presenter, soundman, print journalist, and a trauma surgeon. He's sort of medical vagabond, I suppose, and also a sort of media vagabond, and has had the distinction of working for the BBC, World in Action, we remember that fondly, Channel 4, most of the UK broadsheets, Médecins Sans Frontières, Aid Medical International, and a whole host of third world medical organisations, including the NHS. He's the author of 2 books, The Dressing Station and Contact Wounds, and also a handbook for British military doctors deploying in the field. So I guess my first question is, actually, what are you?
Well, it's a question I get asked quite often, usually by men in suits, when I go for a job interview in a hospital, and they say, well, I see you applying for a job as a consultant in accident and emergency, and how fascinating, you've made a documentary in Madagascar about a missing environmentalist, and you did this investigation on intensive shrimp farming in the Mekong Delta for Friends of the Earth, and you worked as a doctor for an opium warlord in Burma. You clearly don't have the sort of application we need to be a NHS A&E consultant. So I'm defined really by what I'm not. I would also add that my books can be found in bookshops in the travel section, the philosophy, current affairs, medicine, history of medicine, and my favorite is popular psychology. So I'm afraid that you'll probably not get any clear answer to that. One advantage, though, of trying to work in diverse fields is that instead of having to excel in one particular area, you can be mediocre in many.
I think the fact that Jonathan's doing a book signing and selling some of his books afterwards actually answers the question for us. He's a hack. What we're going to do is we're going to look at some photographs. Jonathan's unnervingly talented with the camera and he saves lives, which is a good combination in my opinion, and especially if you've seen any of my pictures. So we'll look at some photographs and then Jonathan's going to do a reading and we're going to have a bit of a chat and we'll do the whole thing all over again and then we'll have lots of questions. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. So our careers have sort of tangentially overlapped in Angola, particularly in Quito, and then later on in Eritrea. So we're going to start off with some pictures of Angola, which Jonathan's going to talk us through with the occasional interjection from me, and then I thought back at the questions, we'll bring them up again, and if anyone wants to ask anything more specific about some of the photographs, then we'll do that then. Okay.
Okay, well, there's no bane like being subjected to holiday snaps, and what I'd say is that this is some attempt to put together an idea of why it is that I accumulate information why I document things as I travel. I keep journals when I work, and they are partly because there are long periods of boredom, and during those times it's good to have something to do, and I do little rather unexceptional watercolors, and I sketch and write. But when things become very pressurized, they're an extraordinary resource because they're such a good place to escape to, because generally people will come and find you if you're asleep. It's an excellent time to get the doctor because he can't get away. If you're eating, it doesn't matter how hungry you are and how long it is since you last ate anything, they can catch you with food in your mouth and they can bring you the vomiting baby or the diarrhea case right there. So it's very occasional that you'll get a chance to escape, to find a haven of peace. And one of them, oddly enough, is writing. If you're sitting and scribbling, people tend to think you're doing something important and not disturb you. So some of the things you'll see in this are sketches and notes from my journals, and it's those plus my photographs and bits of film that I shoot that end up being transformed into books. And one of the things we might talk about is how you digest, or I try and digest, all those experiences and those sources of information and turn them into books. So can we get the lights down? Okay, this is a brief account of a period of time I spent in the central highlands of Angola in a town called Quito, which some people consider to be exceptional for its architecture. Others because they think there's something romantic about being a surgeon sipping white wine among the ruins. But in fact, it's a fairly grim place to work, and I was there during the war. I was there in early 2000 when things weren't going very smoothly in the war in Angola. It had been running for 27 years, and some of the scars in Quito went right back to the beginning of that time. And just for reference, the position of the place I was at was over that little bump in the road there. And the Portuguese had grabbed Angola because it was a suitable place to export slaves to Brazil in the 1600s. But they'd expanded and developed the place, so Luanda, which was known as the Rio of Africa by those colourful Portuguese persons, had acquired tower blocks behind the colonial buildings. There's the old fort on the headland. But really, the Portuguese military government under Salazar had every intention that it would be a powerhouse of development in Africa. And they built a railway across the continent to Mozambique, to their other colony. The problem was that they were also fighting wars, independence wars, liberation wars, in both Mozambique and Angola and in Guinea-Bissau. And the young officers staged a coup in 1974, deposed the old military government, and decided to pull out of their colonies. And there was much rejoicing amongst the people who'd been fighting for independence. And in Washington and Pretoria, there was commensurate dismay because they didn't want some left-wing black government taking over in Angola. So they mounted simultaneous invasions from the north, from Zaire. The Americans, so the CIA supported the FNLA, which was a ragtag bunch with white mercenaries in it. And from the south, the South Africans invaded with an armored column, got almost up to Luanda before they were bombed out and stopped by a Cuban airlift. And the result was a war of stalemate with the South Africans and Americans supporting a bunch called UNITA, the Union for the Total Liberation of Angola. And I met UNITA in 1990 when I was working in northern Namibia as a sound man on a TV crew. And we were driving along the Kaplan filming. It was a wildlife documentary. And we got stopped by these guys with guns and hats who told us we were guests of UNITA and very welcome to join them on a prolonged sojourn inside Angola. And they took us off in our own vehicles to their base. These guys in the sort of blue-grey jackets were members of Namibian Nature Conservation, and it was their presence that stopped us becoming guests for an indeterminate period of time with UNITA. And eventually they let us go. And they were rather jumpy and anxious because their main supply route had been through Namibia, through South African-occupied Southwest Africa, and now it wasn't there anymore because the new government of Namibia didn't take very kindly to UNITA and in fact was friendly with the Angolan government. And shortly afterwards, the Angolan forces, the MPLA government forces, swept south, burnt all the UNITA bases. This was a very famous base called Omega Base, which was the south. There'd been estimated to be about 20,000 UNITA forces here, and MPLA burnt it to the ground, and things moved north. And there were attempts by the UN in both 1991 and in 98 to impose elections and disarmament. In both cases, UNITA kept their weapons, went back to war. And when I was going there, the Central Highlands, which is where I was going to, was a particularly unpleasant place because all these towns were of Mbundu people. They were the tribe that Savimbi took his support from. But during the wars, during the big campaigns, he'd made no, although they'd voted 80% for him, he'd had no qualms about bombing them to pieces, starving them, blowing up their towns and killing lots of them. And I was going to be working in Quito, the big red blob. There were government garrisons in Andulo to the north, in Huambo, which was off the picture, and Luena to the east. And there was a sort of rough front line, which was about between 10 and 30, 40 kilometers around Quito, which was where they were supposedly holding back the UNITA forces. But things were considerably riskier and friskier than that, because UNITA was active well inside the front line, and this is the newspaper clipping on the day that I was going to be trying to get to Quito. Savimbista's ambush truck in BA province, and it talks about 3 dead and 7 gravely wounded, and these attacks were happening all the time. The thing is that when the war in Congo had resulted in Laurent Kabila becoming president of Congo, the MPLA government supported him, so UNITA immediately became part of the anti-Kabila forces and were rearmed with supplies through Rwanda. So there they were in their fresh rubber gumboots and fresh weaponry and ready to be very much more military active in Angola. And they'd also held the northern province of Lunda Norte, where all the diamonds came from. So they were buying fresh munitions, especially fresh ground-to-air munitions. Now, the only way into Quito was on the World Food Programme flights. There were 8 a day of these transports bringing in food supplies. Luckily, the way I was getting in wasn't through the linked panniers of maize sacks, but rather a plane that was supposed to land on the ground. Now, UNITA had these old Stinger missiles. Reagan had given them Stinger missiles because Reagan described Savimbi as the moral equivalent of the founding fathers and armed him with these missiles, which he used to shoot down everything in the air. And although they were old and not functioning very well, they'd managed to knock down 2 transports at the end of the previous year, and it was a risky business. So anyway, we set off. I flew off in one of these aircraft. This is a Russian Antonov with sacks of maize donated by the USA, the same country that was donating the missiles that were trying to knock down the Antonovs. And there's one of the Russian crew in the front. And there was a particular skill to getting into Quito, which involved flying, leaving the coast and flying, clawing for altitude. So you got as high as you could, and then when the plane was over Quito, the pilot suddenly dropped one wing into a vertical spiral dive that took you down onto the ground. Now, they'd pull out just before you hit the ground, except now and then they'd pull out just after you hit the ground. And there was a sample of an Antonov that had managed to land on its tail. And I'm not sure whether aeronautically this is possible, but it had managed to plow in tail first, so it was stuck up in the air with its nose wheel above the ground, and it was a ruin. It was the sort of place that when Quito becomes the sort of cosmopolitan hotspot that it deserves to be, will be the airport bar. But right then it was just a ruin. And there was this rather nice bit of Portuguese stressed concrete Art Deco building, the airport building. There was some lovely architecture there. Most of it had a lot of extra ventilation, unfortunately. And there are the people standing on the ground waiting. These are people who work for various international aid organizations. There's the aircraft, the Antonov up at the top. There's the stripy windsock. And there were some people from Médecins Sans Frontières, the group I'd be working with, and they threw our bags into their truck and we headed into town. I was there with a photographer friend of mine, a man named Guy Tillum, who I'd traveled with and worked with in various places. And he was my passport to these people because he'd worked there several times before. And my impression when I got to Quito was that this place was a complete disaster, that nothing could possibly work. This was one of the better preserved buildings on the main boulevard, a block of modern apartments. I said to these aid workers, what are you guys doing here? That you can't function under these circumstances. They said there's no crisis in Quito. This is an absolutely standard situation. This is what we call stable instability. There's war all around the town. The people, the civilians in the town are starving. The villagers outside the town are getting shelled and coming into the town feverish, starved, sick, and we're feeding them. And sometimes the fighting gets close and we all get put on standby to pull out, and sometimes nothing happens. Welcome to Quito. Now, I looked around and admired a bit more of the architecture, a nice piece of colonial neoclassical stuff. This is the offices of the old Banque de Lisboa. You can see that they're guarding the entrance. I doubt that there's much left in the vaults, but the entrance was sandbagged in case you suddenly had to dive inside and take cover. And I later found some archive pictures of Quito, as it was known in its Portuguese heyday, Porto Silva. And here's there's the building that I'd photographed previously on the left there, the bank, and various well-clipped little shrubs in spheres, and a big monumental sculpture of a Portuguese explorer who discovered part of Africa to the amazement of the people already living there. And it had been a diocese, there'd been a cathedral there, and rather a grand building by the sort of provincial Angolan standards, and indeed much of it was still there. The bell tower was still there. The main body, the nave of the cathedral, had unfortunately fallen foul to termites or something, but there was the tower was there, and I met these kids on my first day in town, and they all said hi, and they all said hi wearing discarded surgical gloves from the hospital, and I thought that probably there were a shortage of toys in Quito, and so it proved. Now, the Portuguese had built housing for the settler middle classes who were all coming from homeland Portugal to set up this coffee growing industry and this fruit growing industry in the highlands, which would be a big export market, and the houses were still there. This is a fairly standard Quito house. The windows have been bricked up except for a little gap over there at the top left so that you get fewer problems with flies and shell splinters. The roof has been replaced by a tarpaulin, and there's that most essential domestic accessory of Quito, which is a kid on the roof. And the kid on the roof is your early warning system. He warns you about large explosions or missiles coming in, and also about the press gangs, the ratissage by the police and the army, who'd go through the town every now and then trying to find joyful, willing conscripts for the armed forces. And there'd been vicious fighting in Quito. It had been damaged in 1975. It had been occupied by UNITA almost entirely, apart from a little area of a few blocks along the main street, in 1993 and 99, where there'd been huge sieges lasting for months, with the government dropping food to the besieged area, with people dying of starvation, approximately 30,000 people on the first occasion and maybe 20,000 the second. Bodies had been buried in the rubble. The water supply of Quito, one didn't drink willingly, but if it did, it had that slightly characteristic, unique, once tasted, never forgotten taste of cadaverine, which is an extract that you don't really want to go into. But whenever UNITA got thrown out, the army would come back and put much more sophisticated slogans on the walls. Here's the T-62 tank in White Dove of Peace mode, and stirring slogans. The youth may be defined by a single word: forward. Here's one of the youth guarding his head with a basin, quite wisely. But each time UNITA would get pulled back.
I promise he is actually a surgeon. It's happening, don't worry, it's coming.
Each time UNITA pulled back, they'd shell the place. They'd shoot these B-21 rockets. They were truck-launched rockets, big things, which they bought across the border, and they could knock down a building if they hit. And each time this happened, there'd be all the NGOs would pull out. The place would be a ruin. And eventually, when the army came in again, the NGOs would come back and start with emergency food, shelter, medical services, and then gradually turn to reconstruction and development. And they were fixing up the hospital. This is where I was going to be working. And it was in pretty good shape. The NGOs had come in and they'd put a new roof on it, and they were busy plastering the scars. They'd painted the front entrance and painted a nice red cross on it so that nobody would shoot at it. I started work. My job was to take over from the young woman surgeon who'd been on duty day and night for months, who needed some leave, and I went through and met her. And I found this very skilled doctor making an incision in a round, bulgy part of the human body. And I thought, oh, that looks to me like something I saw in medical school. That looks to me like a lower segment caesarean section incision. I wonder why she's doing caesarean sections. I then discovered that the surgeon is the person who cuts people, and that would involve doing obstetric surgery, gynecological surgery, neurosurgery, orthopedic surgery. It's a young lad who's taken a bullet through his upper tibia and very neatly splintered with a bit of cardboard box. And I found that I'd be relying very heavily on the assistance of the Angolan técnicos médicos, who were basically male nurses who were going to tell me how to do this stuff, except that they thought I was the expert. And what we do every day is we do ward rounds, but people kept turning up at the Banco de Urgencia, the emergency room, and it was characterized by several features: the bullet holes in the walls, and the fact that everybody who arrived there would arrive in a vehicle, and the courtyard of the hospital was deep, soft sand. So you'd usually be woken from whatever you were doing by the revving of engines as the vehicles dug themselves down. And then the sound of people bringing casualties on stretchers and running with them across the soft sand and up the steep flight of steps into the emergency room. There wasn't a ramp. Sometimes you'd get the sound of the person sustaining further injuries as they fell off the stretcher. But we'd get in there, and we'd start looking at them. And what these guys did, the technicos medicos, was they'd organize the operating lists, and they'd write out these lists for hernia repairs and removal of impacted wisdom teeth and all sorts of things. It looked like a normal hospital's job, but those operation lists would be crumpled in the palm of the hand and dropped on the floor, because what we were really doing was dealing with trauma surgery. And this is a guy who's fallen foul of a mortar explosion. The man up there is doing something that is absolutely unacceptable under any surgical terms, which is probing the wounds in an abdomen with a bit of local anesthetic, which I'd injected first, to see if they go deep enough to penetrate the abdominal cavity. This is known as avoiding a laparotomy, avoiding opening the belly if you can, while this guy is busy tying off some large arteries in the right upper arm that I have put clamps on. And I stepped back for a moment to take a photograph. I didn't often get a chance to take photographs like this, and whenever I did come back from places and occasionally did pieces of journalism, and the photo editors would always say, well, where's the picture of you operating? And the difficulty was always explaining to them that you can't both operate and take pictures at the same time. So these represent moments of dereliction of duty, but things had been arrested. So here's this man, his arm's been turned to mincemeat, and very shortly afterwards I put down the camera and we did the necessary. We took off his arm above the elbow, and we opened his belly and repaired the various holes in his intestine. And at this point I could step back because the stump was about to be bandaged, and my Angolan colleague was busy suturing up the hole in his belly. Now, there was a problem. There were several problems. Among civilians and often among soldiers, they were tremendously malnourished. You can't see this terribly well, but this guy is positively skeletal. People who are very malnourished don't heal very well. They tend to have problems, their wounds break down, the neat stitches you've put to hold their intestines together tend to come out. And also you deal with things, or I was dealing with things that I'd never encountered before. This young woman is 8 months pregnant. She's anemic because she's got malaria and because she's malnourished and she's been in a war zone and we're on siege rations, or she was. And she'd been caught in a UNITA ambush, so she had a bullet that had come through the back of her neck and come out through her left eye. And they said, doctor, come along, operate. Now, I hadn't done much facial or neurosurgery. And the anaesthetist, who was that gentleman over there, was a male nurse anaesthetist, gave her a big injection of ketamine, because that was all you had to give anesthetics. And ketamine is very quick acting, and you give it fast to stop patients vomiting, especially if they're pregnant. Their big bellies, big uteruses, tend to compress their bellies. So if they have food in their stomachs, and she might well have, despite it being a starvation city, she might have vomited and inhaled it into her lungs. So you give a big injection quickly, but there's a problem. People who get a big dose of ketamine sometimes stop breathing. She stopped breathing, and the anaesthetist then did the next thing, which is to clap a mask over her face and start pumping in oxygen. But it didn't work very well if all the oxygen bubbles out of the eye socket. So I was then doing a repair of her face while he was trying to get her breathing again. And as good fortune would have it, 5 days later, we took off the dressing and she was still alive. I'd managed to put a surprisingly neat diamond of skin and bits of muscle to repair her face. She could talk. She hadn't obvious recent memory loss, although it was difficult to tell because Marvin Bundu wasn't really up to who is the current president of the United States. But she still had this rather nasty leak from her nose of cerebrospinal fluid, which meant there was a chance that she would develop meningitis and die. But when I left the hospital a month later, she was still alive and she was about to give birth. So who knows? Might have worked out all for the best, although it would have been better if she'd never taken that bullet in the first place. Now, my journal, which had these neat watercolors, degenerate into something like this. And all those little blobs, those bullet points in the margin, are admissions. This is a busy day. And there's a little sketch of a guy who'd taken bullets through the lower and through the thigh and lower leg. And we were trying to work out how to put him into traction. Outside the hospital, of course, things weren't very quiet because the convoys of refugees, of internally displaced people were coming in, and they generally had a hole in the bum of their pants, and they were hungry. That kid looks rather well fed, nice fat legs, but in fact that's edema from kwashiorkor, and he's not a natural blonde. The result of severe malnutrition is that hair loses colour, goes an orangish red colour, and we were seeing a lot of this. And these children would end up in what was called the critical feeding centre, which were some tents outside the hospital. And those tents were possibly the grimmest thing I saw there, because there were people severely starved, and inside was an inferno of flies and illness. These kids often had pneumonias and dysenteric illnesses, and we'd give them intravenous feeding, we'd give them high protein and milk supplements, and we'd shoot them full of antibiotics. That's a kid being registered as it arrives. And I didn't take any detailed pictures of the interior because it was horrific. And about a quarter of them died despite our best efforts. In the previous year, there had been 176,000 deaths of children under 5 as a result of the war in Angola, from disease and malnutrition, bullet wounds, fragmentation wounds, landmines. Lots of kids. And you never knew. There was this feeling that you were involved, and you were, in most of the time, absolutely having no effect against this kind of measureless folly of this war that had been going on for so long. A town devoted to survival. The only transport was trucks coming from the airfield bringing food. You can see the rather hollow cheeks on that guy. Much of the transport not functioning. Here's a UN truck that had lost its half shaft to a landmine. You can see a warning painted on the bumper. Most of the traffic on foot. People with sacks on their heads coming from the food depots. And Quito, pretty much a town of children, because you'd find kids out on the streets. Schools not really functioning, not many toys. They had a football, it was pretty privileged. Most of them hung out and did the things that kids do on the boulevards, because adults tend to disappear at certain times of day, especially at dawn and dusk, when the military would do their rounds and the police would come looking for people. And everyone they found they'd grab men, youths between about 12 and 50. We'd often lose our translators and drivers in the hospital. And we'd have to go looking for them at military headquarters. And they'd get these guys and they'd tie them together with their T-shirts, front and back. And you get this chain of people being driven through the streets like a cafle of slaves, just like the Portuguese had done all those years before. But here they were being press gang for the front. And all the time, there were these columns of troops marching through the town, heading for the front. And at night, there'd be this subliminal sound of the bombardment on the front. You could hear it when the wind blew from the right direction. There was also often gunfire right on the edge of town, but there was this bombardment going on. And the guys would come back, blown up or shot, stood on landmines, lots of landmines in Angola. These are my colleagues busy taking off a leg below the knee. Ketamine anesthetic has this disconcerting appearance of wakefulness. You can see he appears to be looking, and I always found it very distressing sawing a leg of somebody while he seemed to be watching me do it. Pouring water into the wound to try and clean out the stump. Now, these stumps were full of garbage. They were full of stones and grass and mud. About half of everybody who stepped on a landmine died, either immediately from blood loss or later on from sepsis. You never got the wounds clean. It was impossible to even close them up with stitches. So you just put one stitch around a drain and let it fester on the ward. The wards were full of festering wounds, full of people with dysentery and cholera, so it kind of fitted right in. The amputation ward got a lot of hard use. Guys who survived ended up there. Nice window dressings, window curtains saying, "Don't touch, danger," showing mines and bits of ordnance, mortar shells, hand grenades. It's been estimated that it'll take, to clear Angola of explosive devices, and landmines particularly, will take approximately 100 years, foot by foot, as the joke goes. And those are guys that survived would go swinging down the hill on their crutches to the limb fitting centre run by the Red Cross. I was struck by something. these limb components they had were all different colors. The thighs and calves were brown. The feet were made in Angola. The feet were black. They came from the Sudan. And the arm prostheses were coffee colored. They came from Cambodia. And I thought, where have I seen these colors before? And I realized that on my arrival in Quito, one of the first things I had to do was go and visit the offices of the Mine Action Group. And you got a briefing about mines. And they had all these disarmed mines around, plastic anti-personnel mines made of plastic so they couldn't be picked up by the sweepers, by the metal detectors. And there were these same dull browns and blacks and coffee-colored things. And they were made in Kuwait and in Italy and in the former Yugoslavia. And I realized that the construction of landmines, just like the construction of artificial limbs, was a very successful example of globalization. These industries complemented each other in a pretty sickening way. And these guys would get their limbs and they'd go clanking up and down along the concrete walkway outside. Now, many of these men who'd been press-ganged into the army were subsistence farmers, and it's difficult to wield a hoe over rough ground with a tin leg. So the prospects for them for the future were a little uncertain. But the striking thing about life in Quito, despite its frequent bombardments, despite the fact that MSF, the group that I was working with, had been there for 13 years and required evacuation 9 times, despite the fact that you never knew when the food supplies were going to stop because the planes would stop flying in, was that people were trying to put together a normal life. These low mounds on which the produce is set out are actually grave mounds. This was a cemetery, but it had been a football field, then used as a cemetery during the last big UNITA attack when lots of people were killed. And now, with the rainy season, the mounds were settling into the earth. They were being used as counters for the market, and eventually the whole thing would become flat and become a football field again. But here were people with their little piles of tomatoes and little piles of coffee beans, because the Portuguese had put the coffee trees in before they'd left. You could get exquisite fresh ground coffee in Quito. You could also get Johnny Walker Red, because the military garrison, the officers flew it in. You could get tins of sardines. Could get packets of spaghetti, but really things were short there. The food supplies, the planes were bringing in 66% of the calorie requirements of the people there. Everyone was hungry all the time. And in Quito, I started smoking again. This actually turned out to be a very practical move, because in the hospital, hanging around with my colleagues, my Angolan colleagues, seeing the patients, everyone was hungry all the time. There was no way I could eat anything at the hospital. There was no way I could go home for lunch. So I stayed at work all day, and I smoked cigarettes, because they are a very effective suppressor of hunger. And so it just goes to show there's always some good to be had out of even the most unpleasant things. Life in Quito, the school, kind of roofless, so the classes were happening out in the street. The cathedral had been, bombed cathedral had been replaced by this very extravagant piece of Portuguese Art Deco. And there was one of the backboards in the schoolyard still had a hoop on which they'd made a net out of string, and guys were shooting baskets. Big shell case hung up from the tree as the alarm to ring if the shelling or the rockets came too close. And I worked there, and my colleague came back, and we worked together for a while, and then it was time for me to go back, and I jumped a plane to Luanda, and this is flying into the military airfield outside Luanda, and landed, changed planes, went to the airport, got on an international flight out to South Africa, out to Johannesburg, and there I was sitting on the 747 sipping my drink, and the pilot's voice came over and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, sit back, enjoy the flight. We are traveling at 37,000 feet, a little higher than usual, and traveling a bit further to the west than usual because of an active war situation over the Quito area." And I looked through the windows. I was sitting on the side. I looked to the east, and there was this pall of dust on the horizon and these slanting columns of smoke, as I'd seen when I'd first flown into Quito. And I thought, there were the guys that I'd been working with. There were these people involved in this stink, blood, critical feeding center. And here I was, heading out, severing these incredibly intense relationships. Got back to Johannesburg, and a couple of days later on the wire service, AP reported on Friday afternoon an anti-aircraft missile exploded close to 2 Hercules cargo planes, each carrying 17 metric tons of food, about to touch down in Quito. Planes abandoned their mission and returned to the base. UNITA earlier claimed responsibility for a missile which had hit a World Food Programme plane near Luena in eastern Angola on the 8th of June, which was the day I was flying out. And meetings were held, and the World Food Programme decided they were going to stop all their flights. And Peter Rodriguez, World Food Programme base manager in Quito, very kind man who'd fed me on a couple of occasions when I was there, worked out that they had about 680 metric tons of food in the town, feeding between 160 and 200,000 people a day, and it was anticipated that they had food for 5 days. So there I was, flying back to civilization, leaving behind these people, thinking about what it was that I'd left behind, this incredibly intense involvement, this experience of being part of a community, of living among people with a single aim. Now, the single aim was among the NGO people to be doing the right thing, but actually it was just to survive, and it was for us and the people who we were there to help to survive. And it's difficult to move out of that sort of experience. And so what I'm going to do is just read a little bit of something about that, the segue out of working in Quito. There was something elemental about life in Quito that I was unable to forget, its atmosphere of ruin and survival and last breaths. I was preparing to return there in February 2002 on another surgical assignment when I heard that UNITA leader Savimbi was dead, shot down when his headquarters column was ambushed by government forces. My friend Guy, the photographer, was in Quito when the officer credited with firing the fatal burst arrived in town. The young major had been brought that night to the Esplanade Bar, a spectacular ruin in the town that we often drank at, where he'd taken up station in a big armchair. Who knew where such a piece of furniture might have been lurking all that time in Quito, in the center of the room? In dark glasses, his camouflage battle dress freshly pressed, the man had sat immobile as people filed past to add their tributes, the bottles and the tables and floor around him filling with bottles of beer and whiskey, while he remained planted like a sphinx amidst that forest of glass on which the paraffin lamps glinted. Bereft of that war's sharp realities, left only with that rather cinematic image, the next deployment I was offered seemed oddly appropriate. The telephone rang. "I understand you know about trauma surgery," said a woman. "It's Kirsty speaking from Central Hospital." I professed my ignorance of the institution. "You know, the medical drama. Been running for years, you must know it. We're told it's the most watched program amongst hospital doctors after ER. "Oh, I suppose I must know it. What can I do for you?" "Well, the story is that Claret Kleister, the senior surgeon, you know, the one, grey hair, posh accent, drink problem, well, he's at home and his brother Steve arrives. Now, Steve's no good, we know that from the last series, and he's using heroin and joined up with these bank robbers, and there's been an explosion when they tried to blow the safe, and it went wrong, and now they've turned up at his house on the run with this wounded robber, and they want him to operate." There was a silence. "Are you with me?" asked Kirsty. I hadn't seen this particular program, though I could imagine the format. A perennial feature of hospital staff rooms, alongside the smell of burned toast, was the television set tuned to a hospital drama. Patients, who were always violin prodigies with brain tumors, last-chance pregnancy fashion models, epileptic airline pilots, or forever being rushed to the operating room by the got-the-shake surgeon, nymphomaniac nurse, and alcoholic anaesthetist, amidst the welter of barked TLAs, three-letter acronyms, and the portentous symphony of the machines that go beep. "We need a surgeon on location for a couple of days' shooting," continued Kirsty. "Someone whom the director can consult about how you do trauma surgery, but not in a hospital. You know, improvising." "I see." "I improvise. How about in a hairdresser's? You could call the episode Short Back and Insides." Kirsty was silent for a while. I sensed that she was wondering about my suitability for the job. "This is actually about operating with the sort of stuff you'd find in a kitchen. We'll pay you, of course. Is that something you could help us with?" "Probably. It would be helpful to have an idea what kind of surgery we'd be dealing with, what kind of injury." "Hold on." Over the line came a rustling of pages. "It says here, liver." "A bent spoon makes a reasonable retractor," I offered gratis. "Great, that's great." Kirsty paused to note this down. "We'll send you a script today. Cheerio." So I get on set, and the first bit of surgical advice was called for. I suggested that a man with a severely scripted abdominal wound would tend to lie as still as possible, guarding against the agony of movement. The director corrected me swiftly. He had seen enough emergency room dramas to know that the patient would be screaming and thrashing about. Then we were ready for a run-through, a rehearsal of the kitchen scene. The wounded man was carried in, while Claret Kleister, the surgeon, turned back his cuffs, and the continuity person catalogued every detail in a barrage of Polaroids. The operation was to be conducted on the kitchen table, a futuristic piece of furniture put together by the set carpenters with squares of glass set into its surface so that some of the action could be filmed from beneath. Someone from props offered me a selection of utensils to use as surgical instruments, and I scratched my head over cleavers, corers, spatulas, and salad spoons. I found a small, sharp knife. The director preferred something much larger and intimated the impossibility, really, of doing liver surgery without proper forceps and clamps. I suggested that a proper surgeon would simply pack the wound with cloth and transfer the patient to a hospital for resuscitation and treatment. The director looked at me as though I were an utter wimp. So, there you have it, utter wimpness.
Right. Well, you know, I had all these nice questions prepared to ask you after that, and I still, you know, after all the years we've been friends, I still come back to this kind of like, is why? Why do you do this? I want to go back to one thing that you said there, was that one little quote back from Quito.
Yes.
You said, and about a quarter of them died despite our best efforts.
Yeah.
And you've written 2 books about your experience as a surgeon.
Yeah.
You've decided, for some reason, to write an account of your life, of your professional life, as your personal life as a surgeon. Why do that?
Why talk about it?
Why talk about it? Why write it? Why broadcast it? Why not just do it?
Well, that's the honest answer is that, you know, those that can do and those that can't write about it. I would like to say that both the books I wrote were not written because I approached some publisher and said, I've got a great idea for a book. In fact, it was the opposite. I imagined that I might be a writer of non-medical travel books, just in the same way as all the television documentaries I've made have tended to be environmental documentaries. So I had a proposal in for a travel book on the Guyanas in South America, which got dropped. But the publishing house that offered on it, the commissioning editor said, when he told me he was going to make a modest advance on my book on the Guyanas, said, aren't you surprised that I'm offering on this book? And I said, no, I assume you like my sample chapter and my proposal. He said, not really. I want to do this to get the rights to your second book. And I said, what second book? He said, your doctorate war book. Because he heard that was what I did. And I told him there was no such book. I had a friend who was a literary editor, literary agent, who said, if you ever write a book, I'll represent you. So I phoned him and said, I've been asked to write a book about the Guyanas. And he said, great, I'll get involved in the negotiations. A little while later, the publishing house got bought out by a big international consortium, and the first thing I did was scrap all non-commercial projects like the book on the Guyanas. And my literary agent friend said, don't be sad, let's go out for a drink. So we went out and drank and drank and drank. And he said, tell me doctor stories. So as the evening wore on, I told him more stories, and he doodled things on a napkin. At the end of the evening, he handed me the napkin and said, give me a proposal and a sample chapter. And I said, well, I don't know where this will go, but that's what turned out to be the first book. So what I realized that I was doing in the process of writing it was dispensing with certain fantasies that had built up around the experience. I'd come back from these places. My journals would go into the top shelf of a cupboard. I never looked at them again. I'd be desocialized for a while. I wouldn't really be able to have any kind of intelligent conversation. Sometimes I'd come back from places, for instance, when I got back from Eritrea, where I'd spent some time under the flight path of the Ethiopian MiGs, where whenever a plane came over, I was living in a flat that was under the approach to Heathrow, so the jumbos would come over regularly, and I'd try and get under the sofa, which was only about 2 inches off the ground. So people who were sitting having coffee would suddenly be shaken up. But eventually I started accepting dinner dates, and people would say, well, what was it like? Tell us what it was like. And what you realize very quickly is there is no vocabulary to tell people what it was like. So you start making up these short narratives that have a beginning, a middle, a resolution, some sort of moral point, an appearance that the world is basically a harmonious place and everything in it happens for the best. And it's necessary at dinner parties because you can't really describe things as they are. And slowly these images become the prevailing ones, and when people ask me what it was like years later, I'd say, well, I'd give them the story. So I sat down with the idea of seeing if I could write a book and started rereading my journals. And what I discovered was that most of the experiences that I'd recorded were horrific. They were chaotic, unassimilatable collections of emotions that were involved. Sadness at the loss of patients who died, anger at the absurdity of the situation, revulsion, fatigue. And I thought maybe this shouldn't see the light of day. But some of it made sense. Some of it did seem to have a point. And I realized that what I was doing was something that fortunately few of us are not required to do very often, and that is give an account of ourselves. And that what I was having to do was make an assessment of what I'd achieved and where I'd failed, and whether I'd served any purpose at all. And also, there's a thing about doing work like this. When you work in a hospital, if there's a problem, you call your colleague, you call your boss, if there's a neurosurgical problem, you call the neurosurgeon. If it's a kid, you call the pediatrician. If it's a respiratory problem, you call the respiratory physician. There's a shared responsibility. The idea of being solely responsible for the consequences of your actions is less the case. And in these places, in wars, when you work with people that you don't know very well, you form very intense relationships very quickly. Maybe with somebody that you don't share a single word of a shared language with, but there's some communication that occurs where you hope that it will be communicated that you're trying to save this person. And maybe that you'll be successful, but maybe you won't. And maybe that very intense relationship, that incredibly intimate relationship, will be sundered by the person dying. And you carry these people around with you, these undischargeable emotions. And so what I did was I sat down and I tried to write my way through that, to work out what I'd done, to work out the consequences of my actions, and to work out what I would say to these people, what I would do to discharge those feelings. And it's a lifelong and beyond the grave project. So that's one of the reasons why I took the task. There are also a few others, and none of them, whatever you might think, turned out to be valid commercial ones, because you never make any money writing books.
I mean, it sounds almost partially like an act of atonement, in a way. I mean, if I'm, as a journalist, if I'm sort of writing an account of my successes or failures or behaviour, if I write an unsuccessful article or broadcast an unsuccessful film, my readers and my viewers don't die. But if you're solely responsible for keeping someone in this world or not, that's a very tangible benchmark. How do you... I guess I'm interested in the process that happens between being in that environment, witnessing that, being responsible for that, and then processing these works of literature.
Well, sometimes I'm asked by people, how do you write a book? I don't have an answer. I also have no idea when I'm asked whether, what particular authors might have inspired me or indicated to me how I would express things. I don't have an answer to that. I even don't have a clear precedent for this kind of writing, because I didn't know whether it was possible to write about these things. It's a complete mystery. I will sit down, if things are going well, early in the morning, with a mug of tea, and at a certain point I'll realize that the tea has become cold and I really need to piss, and that several hundred or several thousand words have appeared on my laptop, and some of those will be worth preserving, and some of them, when I read them, will appear to be the writings of a crappy hack journalist, which is what I can be. Some of them will appear to have an authenticity or a truth, and those are the ones that I hope I'm keeping. But really, you know, these are experiences. There is an illusion that there is some fundamental truth that is clearly visible in these places. But the answer is that life there is just like life everywhere else, only very much more so. Life is the way life looks. One of the things that you find there, and one of these elusive things that I try and write about, and I don't know really whether I manage, is this strange restructuring of one's nervous system that occurs in a war. And particularly, I'm sure you've noticed this yourself, when you're under extreme duress, when you feel that any moment, well, the next moment is unpredictable, because the human nervous system is very poorly organized to appreciate the instant. We're good at anticipating the future and looking back on the past, and sometimes projecting thoughts from the past into how they'll play out in the future, but actually being alive at the instant is almost impossible. When you're being shelled, you are only alive at the instant. If you're lucky, there'll be a future, but there's an experience of self-understanding, of perception, which is blinding, vivid, and without falsehood, that is probably analogous to that big rush that heroin addicts get when the first bolus passes through the brain from their arm vein. I wouldn't know. But so there is, all those things are the formative experiences. The process of turning them into something that stands as a narrative is something that works or doesn't work. But how it actually happens, I can't really say.
I mean, you know, you've obviously at certain points in your life, you've been faced with the do something or do nothing question. I mean, Angola's an interesting one for you personally. I couldn't help but notice that you're South African. And you obviously chose to do something in the face of military service in South Africa, and not to go to Angola, for example, or Southwest Africa, and you've voluntarily put yourself into exile. And I kind of, you know, I mean, your career is a wonderful sort of litany of wandering around different aspects of my profession and yours, and I wondered the extent to which the idea of already being in exile prompts you into a sort of deeper exile, both sort of internally and emotionally and physically, geographically.
Well, when I was growing up in South Africa, it was clear that there was going to be some great struggle. And I came from a reasonably politicized family, and my father had been a member of the old South African Communist Party before it got banned. I was aware of the iniquities of that applied in South Africa. And I felt that a change was inevitable and necessary. It was difficult for me to, when I was at medical school, for example, go off and join the ANC as a guerrilla in a camp, because it was difficult. It was difficult because I didn't have the connections, and I was white. Now, my father studied medicine at Cape Town University, and he, in 1937, as a medical student, decided to go and volunteer for the international brigades in Spain. And he was dissuaded from that by a professor of his who'd fought in the First World War and was a socialist, and said, it's very commendable that you're wanting to go off and work in Spain and defend freedom. He had the kindness not to call him, go off and be cannon fodder. But there's a big war coming against fascism, he said, and you'll make a bigger difference if you become a doctor, because they'll need doctors. My father graduated from med school in 1940 and went straight into uniform and spent the Second World War as a surgeon. But it wasn't clear when I was at medical school what form that struggle would take, but it was clear it was going to happen. I left. I wasn't there for the revolution. I wasn't there in the. I wasn't working to patch up fighters in Africa. But there was some sense that what I sidestepped was the great defining struggle of my generation. And whichever side you were on it, you were on in it. Those whites who went and served in the South African Defence Force, those people who went and joined the resistance, those people who worked in trade union activities and sabotage organizations, sabotage cells in South Africa. I didn't play a part in it, and I have a sense that what I've been doing on some level is seeing whether it was possible to do something that was commensurate with what I didn't do at that time.
I mean, your father, I mean, in a sense, you've followed in your father's footsteps in a certain extent. You've become a surgeon, you've operated in war. But your father, in a way, you know, he had those decisions almost made for him in a way. There was a world war, which he became part of in a medical capacity, and that was, you know, fairly not straightforward, but more obvious course of events. It took you from qualifying as a doctor to going to your first war, volunteering to your first war in the first Gulf War in 1990.
91, yeah.
91. There's quite a gap in between there. And again, you know, I have to come back to the question of why. What is the mechanism, the do something or do nothing? Again, that's like, well, okay, I'll do this. Because putting yourself into a conflict situation voluntarily when you are not serving your country in a war and exposing yourself to the likelihood of being killed is not an obvious choice to make. It's arguably not a sane one. And, you know, I've done it many, many times and I still don't have a coherent answer myself. You know, what made you take that step and then keep taking that step, keep going down that road?
Well, it's always easier to keep going than to start. And the reason is that the more of this kind of work you do, the more de-skilled you become. I trained as an arterial surgeon. I could make sutures a millimetre in size and a millimetre apart for hours on end. I was a human sewing machine. I gave up coffee because it gave me a fine tremor. My stitches weren't quite as neat. And that's what I did. I stitched up little blood vessels. Now, I can't do that anymore. I doubt that my tremor would let me. I certainly don't have the patience for it. I do very crude surgery. I don't even often have the choice of where the incision's going to be because it's been made for me by some big piece of hurtling metal. So what I'm good at is, well, not good at it, what I can work in is that completely messy arena and that area where you are trying to do damage limitation. So the more of this I've done, the less suited I've been in terms of professional skills, temperamentally and probably psychologically, for doing the sort of, well, certainly for the ego massage involved in private practice, but for, you know, holding down a hospital job for any longer than 2 days a week. Making that first step, well, it's like any first steps. You know, a guy called me up, a friend of mine, said, we need a surgeon to go to northern Iraq, to Kurdistan. It'll only be for 2 weeks and it won't be dangerous. Now, I was young then. I didn't realize that these are two of the three great lies that are always told to people in humanitarian assignments. You know, it'll only be 2 weeks and it won't be dangerous. Came back from Kurdistan well into my third month of being away, having been, as the expression goes, seen my arse without a mirror, or very near. It was a life-transforming thing to have undergone. Because of that lucidity, of that experience of having seen something that I'd never understood before. And it's a little bit like certain experiences, like the heroin addict, like other moments of intense physical pleasure, for example, where afterwards you think, fuck, that was great, what was it? You feel that there's something there that has to be tracked down and found. It was also the problem that I came back in a slightly hallucinated state, so that I'd be sort of talking to the guy in the corner shop, and I'd suddenly think, I'd suddenly realize that I was talking to the man I'd operated on for a bullet in the knee. in a field on the back of a pickup truck with a flashlight. And I think, what's he doing here? And I actually realized that I'd lost my moorings. So what I did was I went and took a job as a ship's doctor. And I spent 6 months in the South China Sea treating florid epidemics of the worst, most extreme, most vivid cases of venereal disease I'd ever seen.
Another question I have for you is, so I've got this rash, and it really hurts when I pay. Anyway. Before we move on to some other pictures, and we started a quarter of an hour late, so I'm just going to plough on and go on for an extra quarter of an hour, so there we are. A lot of what we do, kind of at least geographically, overlaps. And some of it really doesn't overlap, right? But I spend most of my professional life trying very, very hard to be that impossible thing, or the impartial observer. I spend a lot of time really trying very hard not to get involved, not to affect the outcome of what's going on around me as I document and record what's happening. And with varying degrees of success and failure. And although you're writing about it and photographing it, you are directly participating in what's happening. Very specifically, you're treating combatants as well.
Sometimes.
And I don't have a fully formed question in my mind, but as a journalist, there's this big red flag waving up there. And I know you treated the Peshmerga in Kurdistan, and you treated Angolan government troops in Quito. I wondered if you'd found yourself in a civilian situation in territory held by UNITA, by Savimbi's forces, whether you would have also have treated UNITA troops in the same way, voluntarily and not because they may have coerced you into it.
Well, there's one of the few privileges of deciding to do this kind of work is that actually you can claim to be honestly, as honest as anything can be, honestly impartial. Because when somebody arrives in front of me, I have no questions about who they are. I want to know how they got there in terms of whether they got a blood transfusion or some intravenous antibiotics, but not much more than that. I have treated lots of civilians, and ostensibly my deployments are usually to treat civilians. The nature of the work that I do, which is this sort of damage limitation trauma surgery, means I tend to work close to the front, and that tends to involve people arriving in front of me recently shot, and I don't at that point say, is that a uniform that you're wearing, chap? I go ahead and treat them. So I don't actually have the luxury of having a moral position on anybody who arrives in front of me. So I've treated civilians, I've treated combatants, and it's quite possible that I've treated people who've perpetrated atrocities. But actually, that isn't something that I have a position on. I would not willingly, people say, gee, it's wonderful that you do this work. Why didn't you go and work in Israel? They could really use good surgeons. Or, you've been in Baghdad. You must be a great asset in the green zone treating all those American military people. Or so on. I would not choose to put myself in the situation of signing up for a job that involved working on those sides.
Why not?
Because they've got a shitload of very, very qualified, technology-savvy, resource-intensive hospitals, doctors, surgeons, specialists, scanning machines, everything. The sort of work I do is fairly crude, and it tends to be for people where the alternative may not be any medical care. So I believe it's always good to work in an undersubscribed field.
Let's have a look at some Eritrea pictures.
Okay. So Eritrea. Now, James, one of the questions that James was asking was, how do you make the decision to go to places, and what it is that makes you make this commitment? In Eritrea, it was very easy. I was invited to a friend's wedding. I wasn't there to work as a surgeon. I wasn't there to do anything medical. In fact, I'd been there in 1968, and I'd been traveling there with my girlfriend. We'd traveled around the country and I'd been interested in the history of Eritrea. It had been a short while before come out of a war. Okay. Was this comparable to the relief of Ladysmith?
Yes.
Now, Eritrea had been an Italian colony on the Red Sea coast. The Italians had used it as a base to invade Abyssinia in 1896 with great loss of Italian life, and Mussolini had subsequently invaded Ethiopia in 1935 using tanks and poison gas and aircraft, and using lots of Eritrean levies, Eritrean soldiers in his forces. But the result of the Second World War was that the Allies held Ethiopia, Abyssinia, Eritrea. And after the war, in 1961, the UN gave Eritrea to Ethiopia, to Haile Selassie to look after as a province. And a war started that lasted from 1961 to 1991. It was during which the Eritreans retreated into the mountains, lived in holes in the ground, built underground hospitals at a place called Orota, which had these operating theatres that were supposedly capable of extraordinary feats of surgery. It was a particularly austere, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front was an austere Marxist dialectic movement. Austerity applied in all things, including the size of the shorts. And they taught at their schools in Orota, comparative economics and philosophy and French romantic novels and all sorts of things. Very literate people. Anyway, we were there and we were trying to get to Orota to visit these underground hospitals, traveling up in the north. And there is pretty Asmara, excuse the watercolor, with its mixed bits of architecture. Nice country, Alitalia's sign from before the war, when Alitalia was still there, and a nice banner indicating its workers' solidarity. Bit of an Italianate architecture there. But we travelled around, we travelled up in the mountains of the north, the tracks all full of wrecked Ethiopian equipment from the long war, from the long 30-year war. And on those mountain roads, we cracked the water supplies in our vehicle and they drained out, and ended up pulling up on a track where this man, the man on the right, lieutenant in the Eritrean army, came down and offered to help, and we stayed with them. They put us up in their base, and here everybody who was anybody in Eritrea had been a fighter. They'd fought in the 30-year war, and this was him with one of his comrades with a patriotic map of Eritrea made of 50 caliber machine gun shells pushed into the ground. And this was May 98, 2 days after we left and flew back to London, the war with Ethiopia started again. And the airport in Asmara was bombed 2 days after we flew out. And this meant that the Eritrean people got back to this fighting to the last inch, hole in the ground, resolved attitude. They also meant that they could unleash their heavy literary bombardment. The TPLF, that's the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, dastardly invasion of Eritrea contains all the elements of a Greek drama: deceit, treachery, ingratitude and betrayal, and so on. And they further go on to claim that the TPLF, the Ethiopian government, cut its teeth on Mother Eritrea's milk, had been brought into being by the Eritreans, and now was plotting against its principal benefactor. Now, Berhani, my friend, the lieutenant, was also trying to improve his English, and he had written me letters from the front line in London, and I'd replied to him, and he sent me a letter saying, I've got 3 weeks leave, I'm going to get married, and I'd love you to come to the wedding. So I phoned up my friend Guy, the photographer, and said, come, let's go to Eritrea. And we set off. And we found the place a little bit drab. The war had been underway for 2 years, from May 98, now May 2000, run down, a few beggars on the streets, and the government a little more dialectic, Marxist and bureaucratic than before. The wedding, we arrived on a Tuesday, the wedding was on the Sunday, so I tried to get to see some of the military hospitals, and I'd go in, the military would say, of course you can see anything you want. You're a surgeon, you've worked in war zones, we have the best treatment of casualties in the world. Anywhere you'd like to go, I'd say, okay, I'd like to go to Dekamhare, to the military hospital there. I don't believe I've heard of that hospital, they'd say. I'd go through all the places that I knew there were military hospitals, and this was news to all of them. And they told me, in fact, they never even needed hospitals because they had so few casualties, because the Ethiopians were such crap shots and the Eritreans were so brilliant that really the war was won and I was wasting my time. If I'd like to have a meeting, they organise a program of people who'd been at Orota 20 years before who could tell me what it was like, but really I needn't waste my time going to the front line. So I went to the Ministry of Health, met a few blokes and said, I believe you guys have got an excellent refugee program. And they said, our refugee program's the best in the world. Our refugees are the happiest refugees you will ever meet. So I said, cool, I'd love to meet them. And they said, oh, okay, and gave me credentials to go and visit refugee camps. So this is a lottery ticket. The country was pretty much on a war footing. I'm afraid it's the best map you'll see of Eritrea, but maps are boring anyway. This gentleman and his friend are standing in the middle of Eritrea, and that area of the border that would run along about mid-thigh level would be the central or southern front. That spike on the left would be the Badme front, where my friend Berhani had been based. And this is a map given to me by the Eritrean People's Relief and Refugee Association to send me to refugee camps. And these refugee camps along the border, near Senafe, Midfawalta, Agra too, all places that I ended up spending a bit of time at. We got a lift down there with Médecins Sans Frontières. And these places have been built 10 kilometers behind the old national border, which was now the front line, close enough to be in range of the Ethiopian Katyusha rockets now and then. There's one lying on the ground. They've beaten a bit of the shrapnel of the casing into a flat sheet so it could be used as a school bell to ring the children to school under the tree. And there they were, back to the sort of revolutionary existence, classes under the trees, living a village life under canvas, kids going to get water in the river. The issue was that if the war got close, they'd have to move, pack up their tents and run over that escarpment. And that escarpment loomed above, and it was a climb, because we walked around in the foothills of it, but that was the real barrier. That was what you'd have to get over if the military came. And there they are going for water, and they had guards. They had these guys, these old fighters from the war, no longer active young soldiers, but you can see by the lapel design a man of height of 50s fashion. And they were the people who looked after the camp. Now, I met the young medic, trained fighter who looked after the medical needs of the people. Guy went around taking photographs. And we lived there for a couple of days, and then on Friday the MSF vehicle came bouncing in at great speed to say that the Ethiopian forces had done a surprise attack. The stalemate was over, and they'd crossed the border in force to the west of us on the Badme front, and to the east of us around the town of a town called Alitena, and the war was hotting up, and we needed to pull back very fast because everybody, MSF, was withdrawing to Asmara. And as we drove up through that road through Mendefera, there were tank transporters going to the front. We got back, it was Friday, town was full of hushed voices, people standing on the corners, getting news from the front. The wedding on Sunday, the church almost empty, because everybody had been recalled to their units. And there was Berhani, my friend from 2 years before, with his honeymoon about to be cut extremely short to go back to his unit on the Badme front.
Oh, I have to say, bears an uncanny resemblance to Sam Quayle. There we are.
We went through the wedding. The next day, we discovered that this was a war of many things, a war of rhetoric, but also of press releases. And this is an Eritrean press release saying how the Ethiopians are basically biting the dust. Heaviest casualties yet, fourth day running, their naked aggression is being thwarted. Detailed figures were not available immediately, but Eritrean military commanders on the Marib Setit front, which was the west side, described the scene as a massacre. Thousands of Ethiopian troops killed as they were ordered into human wave attacks. And the government said, the news is great, nobody needs to see what's going on because we're winning. And they immediately revoked from the few journalists that were in Asmara all their credentials to travel. Guy and I had credentials from the Ministry of Health, which said we were allowed to visit health facilities wherever we went. And we headed off travelling west to the town of Kerin, which I'd visited the hospital at 2 years before. And we arrived to find that the hospital contained some civilian casualties of an air raid on Akodet and Berentu, rather, the next big town down the road. And the doctors told me they were delighted that I'd come, that they didn't need my presence there at all because everything was under control. They were having the best possible medical treatment, and those cowardly Ethiopians always let their bombs fly in the wrong place, so they hardly hit anybody. And that night, the next town down the road, Berentu, fell to the Ethiopian advance. And this was announced on the television set in the hotel that we were staying in, and people started packing up and running. And people started coming and trying to buy this higher four-wheel drive larder from us at whatever we'd give, buy places in the car to get back to the capital. But we decided to stay put. And the next morning I walked into the hospital to find that things had changed. There were approximately 200 or 300 casualties on stretchers lying around. These guys are arrayed outside the morgue, but in fact I don't think any of them were dead. It was just a flat space to put stretchers down. And they were being moved from the front. Some of them had been wounded 3 days before, so they had septic wounds, infected wounds. They'd also been wounded subsequently when they'd got shell splinters from mortar bombardments on the first aid posts, and then some of them had been hit in the truck convoys coming across the plains by the Ethiopian MiGs. So you get guys with wounds that were stinking and wounds that were jetting fresh blood, and we had to dive in and operate. And I didn't have time to fulfill the photo editor's wishes for photographs. That's a photograph that will have to stand for part of the experience. You can see that's an Eritrean surgeon holding up an X-ray, and that light shadow in the middle of the chest is a 7.62 caliber bullet that is lodged above the heart, the sort of case that we would probably not be able to tackle at this hospital. Somebody like that would either survive the road trip back to Asmara or would die on the road trip back to Asmara, but we didn't have the facilities to open chests. We did, however, put lots of drains into chests and did limited thoracotomies for people who had big bleeds into their chests, because those we could save, and spent a lot of time opening abdomens. And I spent several days not really emerging from the operating theatre very much. Now and then I'd go out and see truckloads of refugees coming from those same refugee camps that we'd visited along the border, being taken to safer places, people being transferred with their possessions. Eventually I got back to Asmara to find that it was shortly to be the independence celebrations, 9 years of independence, glowing tribute on the newspapers, and there, the eve of independence, people dancing down Independence Avenue, the number 9 saying 9 years of happiness, success, the lights all shining, fireworks over the city at midnight, and a new press release. 4 Ethiopian fighter planes shot down, attacks repulsed, completely fantastic news all round, people rejoicing, dancing. And suddenly, not only was it possible to go to the front, but you were welcome to go to the front. So a group of us, got together and got a driver, and we set off. And I was quite pleased because these journalists asked me to accompany them, and I thought, cool, I'm good company, I'm raconteur. And then I thought, oh, maybe they just want me along because I'm a surgeon and maybe they'll get shot. It wasn't even that. The bastards just wanted to get into my drug cabinet. Anyway, so we travelled forward through people holding up pieces of the shot down MiGs, rejoicing, we're winning. Trucks full of fighters, waving arms, shouting and cheering, going to the front. And as we got closer to the front, the vehicle we were in was pulled over, covered with a layer of mud to get rid of glints. And from ahead came this ominous sound that I must admit I'd never heard quite so close, of a giant door being slammed repeatedly so that your ears rang with each concussion. And then they decided that the Asmara vehicle was too precious to get any bullet holes in it. And the military said, well, they'd take us further forward. And I thought, well, cool, something with a couple of inches of armor would be great. They put us in the back of a pickup truck and drove like shit down a road. And this road took us to the town of Zalambesa, which was inside Ethiopia. And here we are. This is my friend Guy, looking windswept and I'm sure swallowing. I was down as low as I could, fields of rubble and shells coming in. And we hid in that rubble for some time until a man from the ministry of the foreign ministry, Eritrean foreign ministry, came and found us and said, "It's okay, we're going back to Asmara now. You've done what we needed you here for. We're going." And we went back through this town called. We couldn't find out what the thing was that we were supposed to have done. We travelled back through this town called Senafe, people cheering, bunting up for the independence celebrations, and that night the Ethiopians retook Zalambesa and advanced 40 kilometers up this road and retook Senafe, and people started flooding in to refugee camps again. This is a bus smeared with mud. And I ended up in a place called Mendefera, another town, also further to the west but reasonably close to the border, and to this refugee camp called Debaro, which just filled up with people, thousands of people standing out in the open in these ruins of an old Italian barracks that had been bombed by the RAF in 1941. People in their thousands, ruins, and civilians coming into the hospital at Mendefera. And I started working on them. I took a break after some days and went back to the capital, only to be there when the airport was bombed again. Clearly, no flights were coming in or out, so I was going to be staying. The wedding had been a bad idea. And so I went back to Mendefera, which was now in the front line, 40 minutes drive from Asmara on a good tar road. And Mendefera was filling up with casualties. We started operating. Here's a man with a bullet right through his shoulder. And the front line now was about 8 kilometers down the road at Adequala, on the heights that had been visible from the refugee camp, from Agra camp that we sat in below. You can see that there'd been fierce fighting. There were all these expended shell cases. Agra camp was somewhere down on those plains, and the Ethiopians had now occupied those plains and had come up to the heights to try and capture them. Not quite reached the top. There were 3,000 dead Ethiopians lying on the slopes. And the Eritrean newspapers, of course, went on with their rhetoric and their drama about the war and the unfitness of the Ethiopians. And I'm going to give a reading which follows on and closes off those pictures. Then the Addis government declared that its objective, the recovery of its sovereign territory and the destruction of Eritrea's army, had been gained and the war was over. BBC World Service reporters described the Ethiopian withdrawal from the southwest province. Barentu town was back in Eritrean hands and they hadn't even had to fight for it. The reaction among Eritreans was disbelief and then a fierce indignation. They claimed that the Ethiopians were in reality turning tail and running in the face of an Eritrean counterattack, whereas they were simply obeying the terms of the OAU peace talks. The Eritrean government went so far as to announce victory, saying that the Ethiopian pullback was due to the defeats inflicted upon them on the central front. Asmara churned with the usual contradictory rumours. The Ethiopians were regrouping for a huge assault on Adequala. Eritrea was organising massive counter-offensives within the week. The demand now, medically, was for specialist operating skills, but it was reassuring to be reminded that our basic trauma surgery at the Keren and Mendefera hospitals, under treatment conditions only a step removed from the front line, had been worthwhile. I was drinking with some journalists in the capital's slatternly Diana bar when I was greeted by a young man whose eyelid drooped in a permanent half-wink. There was a dressing on his forehead. "Doctor," he exclaimed, embracing me, "remember me, Keren Hospital, shot in chest." After a moment I did. He'd come in with multiple wounds and I'd put a thoracic drain between his ribs. He told me he was due for surgery soon, to have a shell splinter removed from his head. I was delighted that he was still alive. The journalists I was with were delighted too, for a different reason. There was something about this encounter that chimed with their view of the resolution required for a good story. They ordered up another round of fake White Horse whiskey to drink the man's health, and he and his comrades pulled up chairs and joined us. For a brief time a rapport bloomed between the media cynics and the Eritrean fighters as they traded perspectives on the war. The conversation echoed around me. Suddenly I was back in the heat of the operating room, working forearm deep in the belly of a wounded man and feeling his blood soak through the surgical gown above the cuff of my rubber glove. It was among the world's wounded that I had found the essence of humanity. An exile, I had found a home in the suffering of bodies. The survival of this man seemed like an extraordinary gift, a validation of my entire existence.
Thank you very much. Let's have some questions, if there are any questions to be had.
Martin Robson, you showed a picture earlier of the out the plane window as you were leaving
Quito.
And you mentioned about being invited to different places. What caused you to leave? Were there invitations?
Well, I was working in Quito just specifically to spell the person who was going on leave. So, although I stayed a bit longer, I left when an extra mouth to feed can be a problem in Quito, and also, it was an interlude. I was involved in other things. I'd been working in South Africa, and I was going back to South Africa, and so on. But invitations, generally I go with humanitarian organisations. Eritrea was a little different in that I ended up working effectively as part of the Eritrean government medical services. But the invitations are ones when things start happening. I'll get lots of emails from various NGOs who ask me if I might be interested in, first of all, in discussing issues regarding deployments, and then later on in whether I might be consider going myself. And sometimes I'll go and sometimes I can't. And sometimes I'll be desperate and I'll take the first air ticket that any of them are offering.
It's not like you've got a business manager or somebody in a newspaper, is it, who's moving you on?
No, in fact, I've got an NHS hospital manager who tells me each time I'm going away that I probably won't have a job to come back to. So you could see it as the antithesis of management.
By a compassion and desire to help people. How do you balance that with keeping an emotional distance that helps you not go crazy in the face of all of this?
Well, I don't know that I always manage, but there's a certain necessary detachment which you get taught in the process of becoming a doctor, which is that of realizing that actually you're trying to solve a problem. You can understand somebody's pain, but you can't actually afford to feel it, because that would be disruptive. It would make it impossible for you to react in a constructive way. The level to which that detachment goes is profound enough for you sometimes to have to make decisions when there are lots of casualties coming in, of placing people in the so-called triage 4 category, which is those whose treatment is expected. In other words, you wait to see whether they're going to live or not. And when you have time, if they're still alive, you'll come and deal with them. Part of the feelings that are those not unloadable feelings of anger are to do with the people who get involved in causing wars. So when I see some self-aggrandizing prick on the television telling me about democracy and feeling that God will judge him on the rightness of what he's done, I just wish I could have him there assisting me in the operating theatre. I just wish I could make him realize the consequences of his decisions. So my anger and my lack of dispassion are global, wide things that I'm sure I'll always have. When it comes to trying to help people, there is a process of just trying to hopefully do the best you can. And sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's exhausting, sometimes it's tragic, sometimes it's nauseating and you feel you're going to be sick. Sometimes you see disruptions of the human body so horrific that nobody should ever have to endure them and nobody should ever have to try and look after them. But I don't know, moment to moment, you improvise.
You were just talking about your anger at the global politics, and you're a man of quite eclectic interests and talents. So what stopped you from becoming a Bernard Kouchner? What stopped you from getting sucked into the politics and staying within medicine and journalism?
I guess politicians are capable of measured discourse and of seeing many sides to an issue. In the field, they're not much use. If you get a visit from a politician, you know that it's going to be a huge waste of your time, and that it's very unlikely that unless he's got something to eat in his pocket, he's going to be of any use to you at all. Occasionally they do, they come and say, gee, Doc, it's great to see you're doing, what do you feel is the message I should take back home? And I say, have you got anything to eat? Yeah, it's a different, I don't think I'm sort of even-handed enough in my thinking to be a good politician.
At the end of your book, Contact Wounds, Jonathan, you mentioned a sort of veiled wish to have a family or a personal life to pass on what you've done. It's often said that people returning from war zones find it very difficult or rather people at home find it very difficult to relate to those in war zones. There's no nexus or very little nexus. How have you found your experiences have affected your ability to develop, if I can be this personal, an emotional life and a personal life beyond your profession?
My girlfriend's sitting in the audience, so I would say that one of the things that being exposed to these situations has made me realize is that they're actually, and this counterbalances a lot of the negative stuff, that they're actually not a huge number of opportunities for happiness. And if they're there, and if a relationship can be sustained, it's completely extraordinary. And it's very affirming. It can justify a lot of unwise career decisions and squandered opportunities. And make no mistake, going off and doing this doesn't make you a highly paid consultant. It's a complete no-no in terms of financial security, even in terms of the right state of mind to do things like buying property or making long-term plans for a secure future. So I guess that I'd have to fall back on the feeling that it intensifies all the experiences. And when I do come back a little incoherent and desocialized and not good company, luckily my friend Laura knows me well enough to see that that's pretty much how I am all the time, and doesn't judge me too harshly. I always tell a story about her which she absolutely denies, and she's quite right to, because it's completely untrue. I always say that when asked this question, I say, well, my girlfriend, whenever I go away, says, I may not be here when you get back. And when I come back, she always says, you are so lucky I'm here. And it's a great story. Just she won't acknowledge that it's ever happened. Sorry, there's another question.
There's a moment in the dressing station where you're coming back on an aeroplane. You talk about sitting next to a water tower engineer.
That's right.
Thinking that he would have saved more lives in the sort of month or however long he'd been there than you probably in your whole career. I suppose you've kind of touched on this in some of your earlier answers, but I wonder if there'd ever been a time where you wished you had done something else.
Frequently. I mean, there was actually on a helicopter flying out of Iraq, and I sat next to a man who was a water engineer who'd brought water to a refugee camp that I'd spent some time travelling through and working in. And I thought it was an absolute apocalypse. It was the most horrific place. It initially was 100,000 and then 200 and eventually 500,000 people crouched on a rocky, muddy hillside, freezing cold, drinking melted snow, which was grey because it was full of smoke from the oil fires in Kuwait. This is the 1991 Gulf War, blowing up from the south. People dying, being buried, and at night the sleet coming down and all the bodies sliding, re-emerging out of the graves. everyone had amoebic dysentery, so everyone was shitting blood all over the place. It was the only colour in the scene. And I realised that this man bringing clean water into this refugee camp had saved 10,000 people from dying, no question. And I knew that the whole time I'd been in northern Iraq operating, I'd maybe saved 5 or 6 or 8 people from dying. And there may be another handful, I'd say, by handing out sweets in the tablets like sweets in the refugee camps. But really, I'd made very little difference, and that he was really a person worthy of great consideration. Now, there's a certain question about surgeons. There are lots of questions about surgeons. One of them is that, surgeons often have personality disorders, and I wouldn't dispute that in my case. And they demand lots of resources, and sometimes they demand lots of adulation as well. The value of getting a water engineer into a war zone instead of a surgeon is great. The question is, should as I said, I've become de-skilled. All I can do is cobble people up. I could retrain as a water engineer. I hope one day that I'll retire and be an HIV doctor in South Africa, because I think that's a very good thing to be doing. But I'm very aware of the limitations of what I can achieve, and it's another thing that I try and talk about or write about.
We'll take 2 more questions if there are any, and then have some books to sign, I think. Andrew, you had a question.
I can attempt to improvise one. I've known Jonathan slightly to reasonably for a few years since we first met in Baghdad. I wanted to ask specifically about that trip when you did run up. I guess what you were doing was constrained by both the political and increasingly the religious realities of what was abroad in Baghdad at the time. How much, I guess, do you have to be a diplomat in addition to the rest of your lengthy resume that James outlined at the beginning of this, and how difficult does it become to retain the appropriate detachment in that respect?
Well, the big risk of working in Baghdad at that stage, I got there on the 24th of April, so only 12 days after the Americans had liberated Baghdad. And already it was clear that things weren't very stable, and by the time I left, there were car bombs and there was chaos. The big risk was of being shot by the Americans, because they had been briefed that Iraqi terrorists, Islamic terrorists, they weren't even Iraqi, they were Islamic terrorists, were driving white pickup trucks. Now, I was working with Iraqi doctors in the Ministry of Health, and we drove around in these white 4x4s with Ministry of Health written on the door in Arabic or in Islamic if you're an American, which meant that there was a very, very good chance of being blasted. And whenever we came near a checkpoint, we'd stop. We did get around through the windscreen, but not when I was in the vehicle. We'd stop and I'd walk forward waving a piece of paper saying, "Hey guys, I'm a surgeon with an international humanitarian organization. Don't shoot me." So that was the necessary adjustment to dealing with the Americans. I did end up at a clinic one morning. I was working in these little primary healthcare clinics dotted around Baghdad. A lot of the hospitals were out of supplies and bomb damaged, and the clinics were still operating. And I arrived at this clinic to find that there'd been a catastrophe. A family in their car had been approaching a checkpoint, and the checkpoint had opened fire on them, and there were 2 children, 2 young daughters still alive. Everyone else had been killed. And we tried to put drips up on them, and the staff in the clinic said, "Go and speak to them at the checkpoint. They're shooting people all the time. Go and speak to these people." And I walked down the road with my white bit of paper saying, "Don't shoot me, I'm a surgeon." And I got up to this concertina wire and to the Bradley fighting vehicles, and there was this guy on the other side chewing gum. And I said, "Hi, I'm a surgeon with an international humanitarian organization. May I speak to your ranking officer?" went off. And guy came back, young lieutenant, you know, sort of guy, could have been my grandchild, and he said, "Gee, hi, Doc." And I said, "Look, excuse me if I don't shake hands with you, because, you know, I work in this area and they're a bit angry with you, and I've got to be seen as impartial, so I'm not going to shake your hand. Do you understand that?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." And because he was deeply hurt. I mean, here was a nice, well-brought-up, decent American kid, and here I was snubbing him. And I said, "Look, you know, you're shooting at these, you're shooting civilians. You mustn't shoot civilians." And one of the sergeants said, "Well, you know, it's their own fault, man. They aren't obeying the rules of engagement." I said, "They don't know about the rules of engagement." And one of the soldiers said, "They're not fucking civilians, man. These fucking guys did 9/11. And of course, Fox News told them that the Iraqis did 9/11. So if they see a little white car pootling along with a mother and father and kids in it, of course they're going to open fire. So there were conceptual problems about diplomacy. Going into parts of Baghdad that were held particularly by the Shia groups was another question. And I'd go in and I'd turn up, and some guy would ram an AK-47 with particular force into my sternum, and he'd say, you know, I'd say, in my best Arabic, "Good day, greetings upon the many progeny of your fertile testicles," and he'd say, "Anarchia," and I'd say, "No." He'd say, "Britannia." I'd say, La. Junub Africa, South African. I'd pull out my South African passport. He'd look at it, I'd say, "Nelson Mandela." He'd say, "Nelson Mandela, you're welcome." Because Nelson Mandela had gone on television before the war saying that it was an atrocity against human good sense and it should never happen. And so everybody in Iraq watched TV. Everybody knew who Nelson Mandela was. And so I got by on these incremental little advantages or disadvantages of having a piece of white paper in my hand, speaking English, or being a Junub Afriki. And my diplomacy was sorely stretched at all times. So I can't say that anything I did was a success, but I'm still here and in possession of 40 or 50% of my faculties.
Well, I think on that note, I think it's time to give Jonathan a little bit of that adulation and service.